Hey YouTube, today's video I wanted to do a quick review of the Omega Speedmaster CK2998, the 2018 version with the pulsometer scale and the Panda dial. So quick view of that here. Now, of course, this is a limited edition watch, so fewer than 3,000 of these were ever made. And I think it's also quite unique in Omega's collection because if you try to look for Panda dials, there's only a handful that were ever made. And to my knowledge, the ones that were made were in limited quantities. And another thing to consider is that this watch is actually smaller than 40 millimeters, which for many of you, you know that for a chronograph, that's actually quite rare. So a big plus for this watch is that it's actually quite wearable. Now, one of the downsides of this watch is its thickness. So it is relatively thick at 14.4 millimeters in thickness. But I think Omega's done a really good job. And I think Omega in particular, they're really masters at case design. And what they've done here in terms of trying to break down the thickness is actually quite remarkable. So you can actually see that for the mid case, they've tried to make that as thin as possible, and they've put a lot of the movement underneath that case and that bubble back case back, so that ultimately whenever you look at the watch from the side, all you really see is that case side, or the mid case. So it appears to be much smaller. Now moving on to the dial. So a lot of people think this is actually a white face dial, but it turns out it's actually silver and it has a little bit of texture. If any of you know about Nomos, it has a very, very similar texture to a lot of their watches with that white, silvery, galvanized textured dial feel. Now moving on to the bezel. So the bezel is made of ceramic, unlike most Speedmasters, which are typically made of aluminum. In addition, it's also a pulsometer scale. So in theory, if you feel for someone's pulse, you start the time. As soon as you feel 30 pulses, on that 30th pulse, if you stop the time, whatever value you see on the bezel, that should be the person's pulse. Now this watch originally comes on a black perforated leather strap, which is actually quite nice and supple, but it does have a pin buckle for the closure, which I think for this price, you would expect something like a deployant clasp. So from there, that really pushed me towards looking for solutions other than really that leather strap. Of course, Omega sells independently a deployant clasp, but I really wanted something more along the lines of a metal. And that's what put me on a rabbit hole, trying to find a bracelet that would really work with this watch. Now, one thing to note is that the lug width on this watch is 19 millimeters. And there's very few bracelets within Omega's catalog that actually fit 19 millimeters. Now, there was an older Speedmaster bracelet that was made for 19 millimeters, but if you take a look at it, it's quite chunky, and I didn't quite like the design of it. So then later, I was able to find a third-party bracelet made by a company called Uncle Seiko that fit this watch. But unfortunately, the quality was a little bit lacking, and it didn't have the quick adjust features that you see on some of the newer Speedmasters. From there, I saw that Omega had released new stainless steel mesh bracelets. They make a version in 20, 19, and 18 millimeters. So I went ahead and bought the 19 millimeter version. Now, one thing to note is that for all three variants of those bracelets, every single one of them tapers to 18 millimeters. So if you buy an 18 millimeter mesh bracelet, you have no taper. If you have a 19 millimeter bracelet, you have virtually no taper. And that was really my problem with this purchase, is that it's, although it's nice, it is quite chunky if you look at it from the side profile, in addition to having no case integration with the watch. Now, one of the problems with the CK2998 and other watches that share the same case, such as the Speedmaster Reduced, is that they're very prone to leaking water inside of them. In fact, it happened to my watch. And if you go online, there's all sorts of forums with this happening to pretty much every variation of this particular case design. Fortunately, because this watch was covered by a 5-year warranty, I was able to send it into Omega. Omega took care of it completely. They did a complete rehaul of the movement. They replaced the dial, replaced the hands, rechecked it to make sure it's waterproof again. But just a thought to think about, that in general, this watch case is prone to leaking. And I think that's potentially a concern for this watch long term. Is it going to continue to maintain its water resistance? And that's all I have. I hope this video was helpful. If it was, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your feedback is super important. It helps me understand whether or not these videos are helpful and whether or not I should make videos like this in the future. With that, take care.